In preparation for more authentication use cases, let's implement a page where the user can view their profile. So ideally, what I want to allow the user to do is click this hello username content we have up here in the header, and that'll take the user to a page where they can view their profile information. And then in the future, we can support more authentication use cases from that page, such as changing profile details or changing the user's password. So let's start off with the UI. So we're going to create a view first. So let's add a new view in our views folder, and this will be the page where we'll show the user's profile details. So we'll call this the profile view. So let's create that. And similar format to these other views where we're going to have a header and then content underneath the header. In this case, it's going to be the user's profile information. So let me just grab a header from these other views. So I'll take this from the login view. So we're going to have 2 rows and then this text block with a header. So let's copy that over to here, except this time the header is going to say profile. And then let's also copy over these layout properties. So max width 500 and margin 25 on the view. So let's do that. Of course, we can move this to a reusable style if we need to in the future, which in a real application I probably would because we're starting to duplicate it a lot. But moving on, let's implement the rest of this view. So this part is going to be specific to the profile view. So we're going to have a grid underneath our header. So this is going to go in grid row 1 here, and we'll just throw 20 margin on the top. And inside this grid, which is going to show the profile details, we're going to have some rows, and we're going to have a row for each piece of the profile information that we want to show. So some things that I can imagine, we're going to have a row for, of course, their display name or username. Then we're going to have another row for their email. And then lastly, we'll have a row for email verification status. So currently we're not supporting any flows that'll allow the user to verify their email. So every profile is going to have this as not verified for now, but in the future we'll support those flows as well. So starting off in this first row, we want to show the user's display name. So we're going to have another grid here that's going to go in grid row 0. And inside here, we're going to have 2 columns. So let's have some column definitions in here. So the first column is going to be the label, and it'll say something like display name. And then the second column is actually going to have the user's display name. So it's going to have the actual data. So I believe both of these can just be auto. And let's put this data in here. So of course, the first column is going to be the label. So it's going to go in grid column 0. It's going to be bold, so we'll set the font weight to bold, and then the text will just be username. And then to the right of this, in the next column, we're going to have the actual username. So we're going to bind the text to some kind of username property on the view model. And this content is not going to be bold, so let's remove that. And then we are going to have some margin to the left to keep this separated from the label. So we'll just throw 10 margin on there. So let's just copy this entire grid row, because we're going to do the same thing for email and email verified status. So this second grid row is going to go in grid row 1. The label is going to be email, and it's going to be a binding to an email property. And then lastly, this third row, grid row 2, the label will be email verified, and will bind to some kind of email verified property on the view model. So I think this should be good enough for our view. I think there are some minor things we're going to have to come back and fix. But next up, let's create our view model so that we can provide some data to the view. So in our view models folder, let's add a new item. This will be a class for the profile view model. We need to inherit from view model base so that we get our iNotify property changed implementation. And then we need to implement all these properties that our UI needs. So a username property, an email property, and an email verified property. So all of this data that we provide to our UI is gonna come from the authentication store. So this authentication store has our current user defined on it, and this is the current user that's logged into our application. So if we look at this user class, it has all the data that we need. So display name, email, and is email verified. So what we need to do is get the authentication store injected into this profile view model, and then we can grab all the data that we need from the authentication store current user property. So let's get a field for the authentication store defined in here. We'll just call it authentication store. And this is eventually going to get passed through the constructor. So now we can just create all the properties that our UI needs by referencing the authentication store current user. So we need a username property. It's going to be a string for username. And we can just get that directly from the authentication store. So we can dig into the current user and we can grab the display name. And then same thing for email. We can dig into the current user and get the email. And then lastly, for email verified, we're going to convert this to a string actually and display this on the UI as either yes or no. So we're going to look at the email verified, or that's is email verified on the current user. And I was considering doing something where we convert this to either yes or no, just like that. And that would work perfectly fine. But I think I'd rather let the UI decide whether or not we should show yes or no. So let's just provide a Boolean for is email verified to our UI. And then our UI can decide what to do with this Boolean. And then since we're doing optional chaining here, we should provide a fallback in case the current user is null, which hopefully it shouldn't be, but we'll just fall back to false. Then same thing with these other properties, we can just fall back to string.empty, and we'll do that for the username as well. So now let's update our UI to use this is email verified Boolean property. And if is email verified is true, then we want this text block to show yes, and if it's false, we want it to show no. So we can control that behavior with a data trigger. So we're going to have to define that in a style. So let's set a text block style and just initialize a style targeting a text block. And then in this style, we're going to define some triggers. We want a data trigger that binds to the is email verified property on our view model. And if the value of that binding is true, then we want to set the text block text, so the text property, to be yes. And then by default, we can just set the text block text property to be no. So this will display no if is email verified is false, because we won't get into this data trigger. That overrides it to say yes when is email verified is true. So I like this approach better because I don't want the view model to be concerned with what the UI should display. I'd rather have all this logic tucked away in the UI. And there's alternatives to doing a style. You could also do a data converter as well, but I'd rather not create an entire class just to implement this logic. I feel like it's fine to have in a style like we have here. So next up, let's connect our profile view to the profile view model. And for testing purposes, we'll just navigate to the profile view when the application starts. So in our main window.xaml, let's register a data template so that whenever the current view model of our application is a profile view model, we show the profile view. So we have that described in this data template. We map our profile view model to a profile view. So next up in our app.xaml.cs, let's register our profile view model in dependency injection. So let's just copy one of these existing registrations for a navigation service. So this time we want a navigation service for a profile view model. So let's set that up. And now we just need to tell the navigation service how to instantiate the profile view model. So let's instantiate that in this callback. And our profile view model needs just an authentication store. So pass that in, remove this last parameter, and we should be good to go. So now that we have this registered, we can navigate to our profile view model when the application starts. So when we are logged in, instead of navigating to the home view model, let's go to the profile view model. So now if I run this, we should see the profile view, and we should see our profile data on the UI, which we do. So this looks okay. I think I need more margin between each of these lines for sure. So let's do that real quick. So each of these rows, let's add some margin. Maybe just 20 to the top would be fine for the first row and the second row. And okay, that looks good. Maybe I want more margin on this first grid that separates the header from the details. We'll go with 30 instead of 20. And I think I like that. So the last thing I want to do on this UI is have all of our labels and all of our data lined up. So as you can see here, it's kind of jagged where this data is all the way over here because our label is longer. And then our email starts all the way over here because our email label is short. So the way we solve that is with a grid shared size scope. So on this root grid, we can define this as grid is shared size scope. true. And I think I also have a video that goes in depth with how shared size scoping works, but I'll cover it here as well. So now that we have this defined, we can use shared size scoping within this entire grid. So I want to have a shared size scope on all of our label columns. So on each of these label columns, let's define a shared size group, and we'll just call this label. And let's define this on all of our label columns. So the username column, and then the email label column, and then the email verified label column. So each of these columns have the same shared size group, and they're all within a grid that has is shared size scope enabled. So what that means is that all of our columns are going to take up the same exact width, even though they're defined separately. And that's because they have the same exact shared size group. So let's see how that looks. And there we go. Now all of our data is in line because all of our label columns have the same shared size group, which means they all take up the same amount of width. So I guess the last thing I want to do is add some more margin between our label and our data. So let's change that for each of these. We'll change it to 20 instead of just 10. And let's do that for each of our data columns. And let's see how that looks. And I think that looks good enough. So pretty satisfied with this profile view. Now we just need to be able to navigate to the profile view. And we also need to be able to navigate back out of the profile view. And we don't even have a button for that yet. So thinking about how we want to navigate out of the profile view, I think it would be nice if we had a navigation bar up here and had a navigation item to just return back to the home page. But that's a bit complex to implement for now. So I think what we're going to do is just have a button at the very bottom of the profile view that says done, and it'll take us back to the home view. So let's add that button. So on our profile view, in the profile details grid, let's add another row. So add that. And then at the very bottom, in the final row, we're going to have a button, and that's going to go in grid row 3. We'll throw some margins to the top. We'll go with 20. And the content for this is going to be done. So when you click done, we'll navigate back to the home page. So we're going to bind to some kind of navigate home command. So we'll define that on our view model, and that'll implement the navigation back to the home page. So now moving over to the view model, let's have a property for that command. So this will be an I command. We called this the navigate home command on our view. So let's define that property. We'll make it read only and just initialize it in the constructor. So let's initialize this navigate home command to be a new navigate command. Import that from our MVVM essentials. And that requires some kind of navigation service. We want this navigation service to take us to the home page. So we'll call it the home navigation service. And we'll get that passed through the constructor. So let's generate a parameter for that and just import our MVVM essentials namespace. So now we just need to update our profile view model instantiation to pass in a home navigation service. So that's defined in our app.xamarin.cs. So the second parameter should be straightforward to just resolve our navigation service. So let's get required service. And we want to resolve a navigation service for a home view model. So it should be good with navigating from the profile view back to the home view. So before I test this out, actually, I want to rename this service variable for our service collection to actually be service collection, because I feel like it's a bit confusing and conflicting with this services parameter that we use in our callbacks. So just wanted to specify that. I've been meaning to change that for a while, but now let's test this out. Let's try navigating back from the profile view to the home view. So let's click done. Do I want this to be the full width? I don't think that I do, though it doesn't look too bad. Let's leave it. All right, so click done, and we go back to the home view. So now I just want to be able to click this hello username content up here and get taken to the profile view. So that's defined in our home view. So we just want to change this hello username text block instead to be a button. So let's change this to a button, although this might not work because we defined the text block content previously with runs. I don't know if this is supported with buttons, but let's try it. So let's try setting button.content, and try defining these runs in here. Is that going to work? No, I don't think it will. So I don't think button supports runs. So can we just have a text block in here? Let's try defining a text block and move all the runs in there. Is that going to work for us? Oh, it does. Okay, that's good. And I don't think I actually need button.content. I think that's inferred. So let's try that. And all right, that should hopefully work. So now let's define a command on this button that'll bind to a property on our view model to go to the profile view. So we'll call this the navigate profile command. And then now that this is a button, we want to use our button transparent style so that it matches the other buttons in our header. So let's continue with that. And before we move over to the home view model, I realized that these runs need to be all on the same line so we don't get weird spaces between our runs, which we don't want because we don't want a space between the username and the exclamation point, which is an issue that we ran into before when we had these runs on separate lines. So we need them all on the same line. So now moving over to the home view model, let's implement this navigate profile command. So we're going to have another command on our home view model. This will be the navigate profile command, and we'll initialize this in the constructor. So a navigate profile command, and this will just be a navigate command using our MVVM essentials package. And we just need to pass in some kind of profile navigation service. So let's get that passed through the constructor. Let's add a parameter for that. So adding that as the third parameter here. And then we also need to pass that through our static load viewModel factory function that instantiates the viewModel and begins loading it. So to instantiate the viewModel, we're going to need the profile navigation service passed in, and we'll pass that down to the home viewModel. So add that parameter here. And now lastly, we just need to pass that through from our app.xaml.cs, which should be straightforward. All we need to do is resolve the navigation service for the profile viewModel, which we've already registered. So now our navigation should work fully. Whoops, looks like we have errors. Oh, just need a comma here. Let's fix that. And actually, before we test this, I want to start on the home viewModel. So same behavior we had before. If we're already logged in, we just want to show the home viewModel. So let's try this. Everything should work as expected. So on the home view, this header looks good, and we can click this hello username content. So let's click that. Boom, go to the profile view, and then we get to see our profile. Of course, our email is not verified, but we'll implement an email verification flow in the future. So finish looking at the profile, we can click done and go back to the home view. So it should be good on our profile functionality. Before wrapping up, I actually want to fix a bug in the authentication store. So when we initialize the authentication store, so this is done when the application starts, we read the user's Firebase auth that we store in between sessions so that we can automatically log them in. And then after loading that authentication state, we attempt to refresh the user's authentication tokens if they're expired. But if they are expired and we successfully refresh, we don't save the authentication state with the new refreshed tokens. So let's make sure that when we refresh the user's authentication state on this initialization, we want to save that authentication state to our property settings file. So what we can do is just leverage this existing getFreshAuth async method that we have down here, which implements the save authentication state, which writes the Firebase auth. So let's do that. So all we have to do now is just set the current Firebase auth link to be the Firebase auth link that we loaded from the user's previous session up here. And then we can just simply call getFreshAuth async, which is this method that we have down here. And it'll attempt to refresh the auth if it needs to, and it'll save the authentication state with the refreshed auth. So now we don't risk scenarios where we refresh the auth up here, but we don't write it back to our settings file. So that should be fixed, and everything should work as expected still. Let's just make sure the automatic login works, which it does. So just wanted to fix that minor bug, but getting back to the profile implementation, let's summarize that. So we created this profile view that shows the profile details, the username, the email, and the email verified status of the logged in user, and also allows the user to navigate back to the home page. And then we created this profile view model, which the profile view binds to, and we provide data to the view by just grabbing it out of the authentication store, which stores the current logged in user. And we conveniently already had the current user property implemented, so all we had to do was grab that data from the store. And then lastly, we just had to implement navigation between the profile view and the home view. So we have a navigate home command on our profile view model and a navigate profile command on our home view model. So we have navigation implemented between those two views. So in the future, we'll enhance this profile view to support more authentication use cases, such as updating profile details. Anyways, hopefully you can apply these concepts to your own application to implement a profile page for a Firebase authentication user. Finally, if you have any questions, criticisms, or concerns, be sure to leave those below in the comments section. If you enjoyed the video or are enjoying the channel, consider becoming a member. Other than that, leave a like or subscribe for more. Thank you.